Eric Clapton was about to start Layla when security dragged a homeless man out of the audience. The man was screaming and holding a broken guitar above his head. Clapton stopped the band and asked what was happening. When the man said where he found that guitar, Clapton walked off stage and the entire arena went silent for 20 minutes. It was November 3, 2015, at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Eric Clapton was performing the second night of a 3-show residency at one of the world's most famous venues. The crowd of 18,200 was electric, singing along to every song, lost in the magic of watching one of rock's greatest guitarists perform his legendary catalog. But in the upper level, section 312, row 15, stood a man who didn't belong there. James Mitchell, 58 years old, homeless for the past 7 years, stood clutching a beat-up guitar case covered in duct tape and held together with rope. His clothes were dirty, his face was weathered, he hadn't showered in days. But in his hands, he carried something that would stop the entire show. James had spent his last $47 on that ticket, money he'd saved from collecting cans for 6 months. Money he should have used for food or shelter. But James had a mission and nothing was going to stop him from completing it. The year was 2014 and James Mitchell was living in a shelter in Queens, New York. Life hadn't always been this way. James was a Vietnam veteran who'd come home with PTSD and found himself unable to hold down a job, unable to maintain relationships, unable to escape the nightmares that haunted him every night. Over the years, he'd lost his family, his home, and nearly lost himself. Music was the only thing that kept James sane, specifically Eric Clapton's music. During the worst nights, when the memories of Vietnam became too much, James would go to the public library and listen to Clapton's albums on the computers there. Layla had a way of quieting the demons in his head, even if just for a few minutes. One cold morning in November 2014, James was walking his usual route through the industrial areas of Queens, looking for cans and bottles to recycle. He passed by the back of an old music store that had closed down months earlier. The building was being cleared out, and there were dumpsters full of broken instruments, old equipment, and trash. Something made James stop and look closer. Sticking out of one of the dumpsters, barely visible under a pile of cardboard boxes, was a guitar case. It was old, falling apart, covered in mold and water damage. Most people would have walked past it, but James had learned long ago that sometimes the things people throw away are the things worth keeping. He pulled the case out of the dumpster. It was incredibly heavy and the latches were rusted shut. Using a piece of metal he found nearby, James pried the case open.
Inside was a guitar, but not just any guitar. It was a Fender Stratocaster, and even in its destroyed condition, James could tell it had once been something special. The body was scratched and dented, 2 of the strings were broken, the neck had a crack running down it. Someone had spray painted over parts of it. But underneath all the damage, James could see it was a vintage instrument. James carefully lifted it out of the case. As he did, something fell out from inside the body of the guitar through the crack in the wood. It was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded multiple times. With shaking hands, James unfolded the paper. It was a receipt. A purchase receipt from Selmer's Music Shop in London, dated August 15, 1963. The receipt was for one Fender Stratocaster, serial number L05732, purchased for £175. At the bottom of the receipt, written in faded blue ink, were the words, "First professional guitar, first real paycheck, never letting this go. E.C." E.C. Eric Clapton. James stood in that alley, holding a guitar that had once belonged to his hero, and he started to cry. He didn't know how this guitar had ended up in a dumpster in Queens. He didn't know how it had gotten so damaged. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This guitar needed to go home. For the next 11 months, James Mitchell devoted every spare moment to restoring that guitar. He knew he couldn't afford professional restoration, so he did what he could with the materials he had access to. He used wood glue from the dollar store to try to seal the crack in the neck. He used duct tape to hold parts together. He found replacement strings in trash bins behind music stores. He carefully cleaned off the spray paint with nail polish remover he bought one bottle at a time. The other homeless people in the shelter thought James was crazy. Why spend time restoring a broken guitar when he could be working on finding a job or a place to live? But James understood something they didn't. This wasn't just about a guitar. This was about returning something precious to someone who'd given him so much through his music. James kept the receipt with him at all times, sealed in a plastic bag to protect it. He researched everything he could about Eric Clapton at the public library. He learned that Clapton had indeed lost his first professional guitar decades ago. In interviews from the 1980s and 90s, Clapton had mentioned it, saying he'd lent it to someone in the late 1960s and it had never been returned. He'd assumed it was gone forever, probably destroyed or sold off years ago. By October 2015, James had done everything he could to restore the guitar. It would never look like it did in 1963, but it was playable again. The crack in the neck was reinforced. The body was cleaned. It had new strings. It would never be worth what it once was, but it was recognizable as a vintage Stratocaster.
Then, James learned that Eric Clapton would be performing at Madison Square Garden in November. 3 shows. This was his chance. James spent the next 6 months collecting every can and bottle he could find. He skipped meals. He walked miles every day searching for recyclables. Other homeless people who knew what he was doing started giving him their cans. The shelter workers, moved by his dedication, helped him save money. By October 2015, James had $47. A nosebleed seat ticket to Clapton's show cost $45. On November 3, 2015, James Mitchell cleaned himself up as best he could at the shelter, put on his least dirty clothes, carefully placed the guitar in its taped-up case, and took the subway to Madison Square Garden. He had $2 left in his pocket. Security at Madison Square Garden didn't want to let him in. A homeless man with a guitar case didn't fit the profile of a typical concert goer. But James had a ticket. He had a right to be there. After 15 minutes of argument and showing his ticket multiple times, they finally let him pass through. James found his seat in the upper level. It was the furthest seat from the stage he'd ever seen in his life, but he didn't care. He could see Eric Clapton. That was enough. For the first hour of the concert, James sat quietly, holding the guitar case on his lap, watching Clapton perform. Every song brought tears to his eyes. Wonderful Tonight, Cocaine, Tears in Heaven. This music had saved his life more times than he could count, and now he was finally seeing it performed live. But James hadn't come just to watch. He'd come to return what belonged to Eric Clapton. When Clapton began the opening notes of Layla, something inside James snapped. This was his song, the song that had quieted his nightmares, the song that had kept him alive. This was the moment. James stood up. He opened the guitar case and pulled out the restored Stratocaster. He held it above his head with both hands. "Clapton!" James screamed at the top of his lungs. "I found your guitar! Your first guitar!" The people around him turned to stare. Some moved away, uncomfortable. Security in his section immediately started moving toward him. "I found it in the trash," James continued screaming, his voice raw with emotion. "It's your 1963 Stratocaster. I fixed it for you. Please." The guards started pulling James toward the aisle. Other concert-goers were standing now, some filming on their phones, some shouting at security to let him be, some shouting at James to sit down and stop disrupting the show. Eric Clapton stopped playing. The band, confused, gradually fell silent. The entire arena, 18,200 people, went quiet as everyone turned to see what was happening in Section 312. Clapton walked to the edge of the stage, holding his hand up to shield his eyes from the stage lights, trying to see what was happening in the upper level. "What's going on?" Clapton asked into his microphone, his voice echoing through the silent arena. One of the security guards spoke into his radio. Clapton's stage manager came out and whispered something to him. Clapton shook his head and spoke into his microphone again. "Wait," Clapton said. "Bring him down here." The security guards stopped dragging James toward the exit. The entire upper level heard Clapton's words through the speakers. Slowly, the guards turned around and began escorting James down toward the stage instead of out of the building. The walk from Section 312 to the stage floor took 10 minutes. James, escorted by security, carrying his broken guitar, walked downstairs, through corridors, down more stairs, across the floor level, past thousands of staring people. The entire arena watched in silence. Clapton stood on stage, waiting, having no idea what was about to happen. When James finally reached the floor-level security barrier, Clapton gestured for the guards to help him onto the stage. James, shaking, filthy, clutching the guitar like a lifeline, climbed onto the stage at Madison Square Garden in front of 18,000 people. Eric Clapton looked at the man standing before him. Homeless, clearly struggling, obviously emotional. Then Clapton looked down at the guitar in James's hands. Even from a distance, even covered in duct tape and clearly damaged, something about it looked familiar. "What is this?" Clapton asked gently. James's voice shook as he spoke, but the microphone Clapton was holding picked up every word. "Mr. Clapton, I found this guitar in a dumpster in Queens in 2014. It was destroyed, but there was a receipt inside it from 1963 from Selmer's Music Shop in London." James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the plastic-sealed receipt. He handed it to Clapton with trembling hands. Clapton unfolded the receipt. His hands started shaking as he read it. His face went pale. He looked at the guitar in James's hands, then back at the receipt, then at James. "This can't be," Clapton whispered, but the microphone carried his words through the entire arena. "This is impossible." "I spent 11 months fixing it," James said, tears streaming down his face. "I used duct tape and glue and whatever I could find. I know it's not perfect, but it's yours. It needs to go home." Eric Clapton took the guitar from James's hands. His fingers traced over the duct tape, the repairs, the damage. He turned it over and found the serial number stamped on the back of the headstock, L05732, the same number on the receipt. It was his first professional guitar, the Stratocaster he'd bought in 1963 with his first real paycheck, the guitar he'd played in his earliest professional shows, the guitar he'd lent to someone in 1967 or 68 and never seen again, the guitar he'd mourned for decades, thinking it was lost forever. And a homeless veteran had found it in a trash bin in Queens and spent 11 months restoring it with duct tape. Clapton sat down on the edge of the stage, holding the guitar, and started crying. Not quiet tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs. His band members stood behind him, not knowing what to do. The audience watched in stunned silence. After a minute, Clapton composed himself enough to speak. He looked up at James, who was still standing there, unsure of what to do. "What's your name?" Clapton asked. "James Mitchell, sir. I'm a veteran, Vietnam. I've been homeless for 7 years. Your music, it's the only thing that keeps me going when things get bad."
Clapton stood up and pulled James into a hug. The image of the rock legend embracing the homeless veteran, both crying, holding the broken guitar between them, was captured by thousands of phone cameras and would be shared around the world within hours. "You spent 11 months fixing this?" Clapton asked, his voice breaking. "Yes, sir. I used whatever I could find. I know it's not professional, but it's perfect," Clapton interrupted. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Clapton turned to address the audience, his arm around James's shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is James Mitchell. James found my first professional guitar, a guitar I bought in 1963 and lost in the late 60s in a dumpster. And instead of selling it, instead of keeping it, he spent 11 months of his life, while homeless, restoring it so he could return it to me. I want you to understand what that means." The arena erupted in applause. James stood there, overwhelmed, unable to process what was happening.
"James, how much money do you have?" Clapton asked quietly, away from the microphone. $2, sir. I spent everything else on the ticket." Clapton turned to his road manager in the wings and said something. Then he turned back to James. "Here's what's going to happen. You're not leaving this arena tonight. We're going to get you cleaned up, get you fed, and then we're going to find you a place to live. And you're going to play this guitar with me, right now." "Sir, I can't play," protested James. "I never learned how. I just fixed it." "I'll teach you," Clapton said, "right now, in front of 18,000 people. It's the least I can do for someone who gave me back my first love." For the next 20 minutes, the concert stopped completely. Eric Clapton sat on the stage with James Mitchell and taught him how to play 3 basic chords on the restored 1963 Stratocaster. The audience watched in reverent silence as the master taught the homeless veteran the basics of guitar playing on the very instrument that had started Clapton's legendary career. When James could play the 3 chords reasonably well, Clapton stood up and they played together. Clapton played the lead to Wonderful Tonight, while James played the 3 chords over and over. It was the simplest, most imperfect, most beautiful performance of that song Clapton had ever given. When they finished, the standing ovation lasted 15 minutes, not for the music, but for what it represented. A homeless veteran who'd spent everything he had to return something precious. A rock legend who recognized that this moment was more important than any show. After the concert, Clapton made good on his promise. His team got James into a hotel that night. The next day, they helped him into a rehabilitation program for veterans with PTSD. Clapton personally paid for James's treatment, housing, and living expenses for 2 years. But Clapton did more than that. He had the guitar professionally restored by the best luthiers in the world, but with one condition. Every piece of James's duct tape repairs had to be preserved under a protective coating. The guitar now sits in Clapton's private collection, and it's the only guitar he owns that has visible duct tape on it.
That duct tape represents something more valuable than any vintage guitar, Clapton said in an interview 6 months later. It represents sacrifice, dedication, and kindness from someone who had nothing but gave everything. James Mitchell is 67 years old now. He's been sober for 8 years and has his own apartment in Queens. He works as a volunteer at a veterans center, helping other homeless vets get the help they need. And once a month, he visits Eric Clapton's recording studio, where Clapton teaches him guitar. "Eric gave me my life back," James says. "I gave him a guitar. He gave me everything." In 2018, Clapton released a song called "Found in the Trash," dedicated to James Mitchell. The music video shows the story of the guitar's journey, from Clapton's purchase in 1963 through its loss, its years in the dumpster, James finding and restoring it, and their meeting at Madison Square Garden. All proceeds from the song go to homeless veteran organizations. The moment at Madison Square Garden became one of the most shared concert videos in history. It was covered by every major news outlet, discussed on talk shows, and used as a teaching example in business schools about the power of purpose and dedication. But for James Mitchell and Eric Clapton, it was never about attention or fame. It was about a homeless veteran who understood that some things are too precious to keep for yourself, even when you have nothing. And about a rock legend who recognized that the most valuable things in life aren't things at all. They're the people who care enough to give them back to you. The 1963 Fender Stratocaster, serial number L05732, with its professional restoration and preserved duct tape repairs, is now insured for $2 million. But when Clapton is asked about its value, he always says the same thing. It's priceless, not because of what it is, but because of who brought it home. James Mitchell taught me that redemption comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes through music, sometimes it comes through service, and sometimes it comes through a broken guitar in duct tape, carried by a man who had every reason to keep it for himself, but chose to give it back anyway. Today, James keeps a small piece of the original duct tape he used to repair the guitar, framed on his wall. Next to it is a photo from that night at Madison Square Garden, Clapton teaching him to play, both smiling, the broken guitar between them. Below the photo are 8 words that James says every morning. I found what was lost. He found me too.